So in the prior mini module, I mentioned that there's three groups of individuals involved or stakeholders involved when we think about cybersecurity, business, and the workplace. And we talked about cybersecurity and customers. We should also talk about cybersecurity and workers, and then cybersecurity and the leaders. Cybersecurity workers, when we think about this overlap, what often comes to mind is the need for more training and to make sure that we've trained our cybersecurity workers effectively. And it's in some ways it's necessary, obviously, and I'm going to spend just a little bit now talking about this idea of training. Then I am going to jump into leadership, and I'm going to come back to workers and cybersecurity and workers, because it's hard to separate leaders and workers. In some ways, workers are supposed to be leaders and leaders are workers, and there is a fine line between them. But in this context, when I'm thinking about workers, I am thinking about that group that we say we need to train these people who are dealing with customers or customer information or client information or client data, and we need to train them to make sure that they're doing everything they can to protect that data. Now this is interesting, and it's relevant to technology, because we often talk about training how to use technology, training how to protect technology, and training about why that's important. And at the same time, we drive home these points that we need to have safe technology in a safe cyber environment. However, many of the problems that we have in the cyber world, when we think about cyber incidents, many of them come from mistakes that people make, not mistakes that the software made or that the hardware made. Many cybersecurity incidents, some would say the vast majority, stem from human error. And there's this saying that you'll hear that the problem is in the chair, not in the software. And what that's alluding to is the chair that the worker is sitting in front of their computer, they end up doing something naive and foolish. I mentioned in the prior mini module about the business, and many businesses do this. They send out fake emails to their employees, phishing emails, to see who will respond. And they'll try different techniques. I was talking with a security official who said one they do is they send out the romance scams to see which of their employees will click on a romance bait scam. And then they'll find which ones do it. And then they have to call the employees in and say, don't do that. And they could say, if you keep doing it, we're going to can you. The theory there is that as part of that training, they follow it up with a practice or an activity that drives home what they're talking about. But the question we have to ask is whether training is enough. Because everybody gets training, and if everybody's getting training, why do we continue to have these issues and these problems when it comes to cybersecurity being tied to human error? Well, one of the answers is that humans make mistakes. That's obviously going to happen. Another answer, though, is the fact that sometimes it's not insider error, but it's insider offending. You're going to read about in some of the readings that you have for the class, and in the next module, you're going to read about a concept called white-collar cybercrime. And this notion of white-collar cybercrime simply refers to the fact that some types of cybercrime happen in the workplace. And doesn't necessarily mean they're white-collar professionals, but it means that people working at work commit a cyber crime while they're at work. And there's two concepts there that are being joined together. There's the concept of white-collar crime, and there's the concept of cyber crime. Now, white-collar crime is traced to Edwin Sutherland, who wrote about this and talked about it. He was a former president of the American Sociological Association, and he developed this concept called white-collar crime, where he said white-collar crime is crime committed at work by workers during the course of work. And those elements are particularly significant, and while he called it white-collar crime, there's also the subsequent researchers who've taken that and broadened it to include any time that people commit types of crime at work as being white-collar crime. So if someone steals from work, that could be a white-collar crime. If someone steals from customers, if a doctor overcharges people, that would be white-collar crime. If a nurse steals drugs at work, that would be white-collar crime. And there's many, many examples we could give of white-collar crime. In contrast, cybercrime is when people use computers to commit crime. So what we're talking about here with the notion of white-collar cybercrime is the simple point that sometimes people at work use computers to commit crime. Now, Sutherland, he didn't talk about white-collar cybercrime. I wonder why. Oh, they didn't have computers when he wrote about this back in the 40s. That's why he didn't write about white-collar cybercrime. We make this distinction here because it's important to recognize that there is overlap between this discipline or this area of study called white-collar crime and this area of study called cybercrime. And because there's overlap between an area of study and an area in one area and in another area, we have to call into question whether the way that we respond to these behaviors ought to be similar or not. Because there are specific responses in the workplace that are used to respond to white-collar criminal behavior. There's also specific responses that are used to respond to cybercrime. So do we learn from one of these responses over the other? Do we join them? And do we find better ways to respond to these crimes when we use this response that's more grounded in a response that looks at the dynamics of the offense and the dynamics of the offender as well and brings them together. Now, another point that we'd make when we ask, is training enough? There's an old quote I heard a while back. This one's excellent. And if you're ever in a training or developing training, I encourage you to think about it. The quote goes like this: if you can hold a gun to their head and they can do it, you don't have a training problem, you have a motivation problem. One more time. If you can hold a gun to their head and they can do it, you don't have a training problem, you have a motivation problem. Now let's think about this, because it makes perfect sense. Do you know that you need to have safe passwords? Yes, I think we all know that. Even my aging parents who didn't see computers until a couple of years ago, they know that you need safe passwords. Do you know that you're not supposed to respond to the email where they tell you that you've just won $15 million? You probably do know that. Do you actually need to be trained about that? Do you know that you shouldn't steal company data through the computer? Now, if you don't know these things, if your employee doesn't know these things, maybe they shouldn't have been hired in the first place. perhaps the problem isn't training, but the problem is motivation. And so that's where we need to, with our workers, we need to start thinking about the motives of behaviors. And how do we get behaviors that are more consistent with company values? How do we get behaviors that aren't based in errors being made by employees? Now, one of those ways is through the example I gave, where you have not just training, but you have follow-ups and you identify employees who are susceptible for risk and you give them reasons not to do it. Because if you can give them a reason not to do it, you're going to be fired if you do this. Then those errors might be less likely to occur. If you can give them reasons, and some have said, it's a name of a book, start with why. Tell your employees why they need to practice safety. Everyone knows we need to be safe. Does everyone know why we need to practice safety? It's that starting with why that would help a business with their workers to see why they need to engage in these safe behaviors. Now, is training enough when we talk about cyber offending? Can you tell someone and train someone not to be a criminal? Probably not. Most certainly, probably not. That was perhaps a little bit redundant. But what I would suggest is that when hiring individuals, we certainly need to use practices and incorporate practices that might identify higher risks of offending. And then we would build into these mechanisms strategies that help to protect the environment, strategies that make workers more accountable. Some businesses, for example, would part of the reason they keep workers in close contact to one another is that the workers would provide guardianship towards one another. And the reason that many businesses might have these glass offices is so that workers, while it's believed to or promoted as building community in this environment when everyone can see one another, the other idea we would point out is that if everyone can see everyone, when people are being watched, they're less likely to do bad things, whether it's an error or offending. So again, training isn't going to stop workers from either intentionally doing bad things or unintentionally doing bad things, but it's the whole package of the business. It's how we hire individuals, it's how we train them, how we mentor them, how we monitor them, how we communicate with them, how we motivate them to engage in behaviors that are safe for the workplace and that build the workplace in the way that we want it to be built. And it's also how we reward our employees and our workers. Now, interestingly, some people have said, and some white-collar crime researchers have said, you really should let your workers occasionally do bad things. If you can let them get away with some occasional bad things, they're happy. People are happier. Now, we don't want our workers to publicize everyone's data and information. We don't want that to be the thing that we let them get away with. But some people have said, for instance, let them take a 20-minute break. If the break's only 15 minutes, let them get away with that. Let them get away with these little minor transgressions. Don't let them get away with the big stuff, though. And again, the culture and the environment there that's going to be built and it's going to be developed and it's going to be supported is going to have a role in contributing to the types of behaviors that we would see from our employees. It starts at the top. And because it starts at the top, that's why we're going to spend much of the rest of these several mini modules talking about cybersecurity and leaders. And we'll use that discussion to lead you into your module on cybersecurity in business.